We will begin this session on 2 minutes. Everyone, please take your seat. Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of JNU Academic, I, Kishan Kumar, would like to welcome you all for our second session of the day on violence and modernity. Without further delay, I want to take this opportunity to introduce our Honorable Chair and speakers of the session. The session will be chaired by Professor Anupama, CJ, Professor at Center for Political Studies, JNU. Her area of interest include citizenship studies, political institutions, political anthropology of institutions, gender studies and political concepts. Her recent book, Citizenship, Regimes, Law and Belongings, is published by Oxford University Press. She has also edited a book titled Election Commission of India by Oxford University Press. I will now introduce our panelists, Dr. Ananya Vajpayee, Professor Aparna Vaidik and Professor Dilip Simeon, one by one. Dr. Ananya Vajpayee is a fellow and associate professor at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies, New Delhi. Trained in Sanskrit as well as modern Indian and Romance languages and literature, she works at the intersection of intellectual history, political theory and critical philology. She is the author of award-winning book Righteous Republic, The Political Foundations of Modern India, and co-edited Ashish Nandi, A Life in Dissent and well as Minority and Populism. She is currently writing a political biography of Sanskrit in modern times along with her long-term project on the life and ideas of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. A Rhodes Scholar, she was educated at JNU, Oxford University and the University of Chicago. She has been a fellow among other institutions at Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, the Library of Congress, the Center of Law and Governance, JNU, the School of Advanced International Studies, and the Center for Research in the Arts, Social Science and Humanities at Cambridge University. Our next speaker in line is Professor Aparna Vaidik, who is a renowned historian. She is a professor of history at Ashoka University. Her latest book, My Son's Inheritance, A Secret History of Blood, Justice and Lynching in India, is an insightful and thought-provoking work that challenges India's prevailing narrative as an inherently peaceful society. Her areas of interest include the politics of violence, Gandhi and world history and colonialism and culture. Her most recent monograph is Waiting for Swaraj, Inner Lives of Indian Revolutionaries, published by Cambridge University Press. The next speaker of the session is Professor Dilip Simeon. He is a visiting professor at Ashoka University. He is a well-known labor historian and public intellectual. He is also the founding member of Association of Indian Labor Historians. He has earlier taught history at Ramjas College, University of Delhi. He has been a visiting scholar at University of Sussex, Bristol University, and a School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London, among other institutions. He is a social activist with particular interest in conflict and post-conflict setting in South Asia. He is also the author of Revolution Highway. We are immensely thankful to our chair and a speaker for gracing us with their presence. Moving forward, I would like to hand over the floor to Professor Anupama for carrying on with the further proceeding. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And welcome back to this session of the conference. And feel especially privileged to be chairing this session. All the sessions have been special, but this session is, I feel, especially special because it has sequestered violence as a theme to make it the single theme of a session. So, which means that all three speakers and the audience are going to deliberate on violence in a way which is desirable, especially in context where there seems to be conditions replete with different kinds of violence. One of the things that I would want to suggest, I'm not going to speak a lot, but over the sessions yesterday and the morning session, the emphasis has been on how one can use concepts with some degree of precision. And when one talks of violence, violence is one concept that has been for quite some time, but before the 1980s in particular, been largely the domain of what is considered the activist domain, rather than something that must be subjected to intellectual and theoretical scrutiny. And I'm referring this in particular to, in keeping in mind a comment that was made by G. Hargopal a long time back, in his introduction to Balagopal's writings, and the particular book that Hargopal had edited was called Probings in the Political Economy of Agrarian Relations and Conflicts. And the point that Hargopal was making was about the intellectual division of labor, especially in EPW, where the special articles were the articles by experts and the commentaries which were dealing with violence of everyday nature, etc., were those that were being talked about and written about by activists. So 1980s onwards, there has been an impressive scholarship on violence, and most recently, Meera Chandok's book on Violence in Our Bones has persuaded us to look at violence as a category that perhaps has its distinguishable core, but it's also something that makes other concepts intelligible to us. So if you were to think of entrenched concepts like state, like the nation state, or even, as the speakers are going to focus on, history and law, all these concepts would look different if we were to think about violence as structuring these concepts in particular ways. Also, concepts like authority, legitimacy, power, force, which people like Chandok and Hannah Arendt are also looking at, in exploring their relationships with violence. These concepts in relationship or clustered with violence would definitely look different. In terms of, again, the discussions and arguments that have lingered on since yesterday, there is a way in which violence would inflect the way in which the cognitive space of concepts are arranged. So if you were to think of violence outside the domain of the text and look at it in terms of the relationships of social power maybe, or the ways in which the space of concepts is ambiguously configured, and think of ways in which violence would lead on to thinking about other concepts which are more in the domain of affect, feelings. The idea of resentment was talked about yesterday, fear as something that is inherent to violence, and estrangement is something that was also talked about yesterday. How would estrangement, when counterposed to familiarity, give rise to different kinds of violence? Looking at the colonial debates on how dominion over the native was a form of violence, and domestication and familiarity then became violence. Thinking about intimate spaces of violence, which is what the feminists asked us to do through much of the 80s and 90s onwards, and also the way in which the debate on the experiential aspect of violence and how concepts would look different when one talked about concepts being an outcome of how people think and relate to their life worlds. How would then these feelings express themselves, and that would again give us different insights on violence. So let me also say that the three speakers here are one has admired all three for the different for the exceptional and remarkable ways in which in their writing and speech they have expressed courage and exceptional erudition. And I still would remember Dilip Simeon, the legacy of Dilip Simeon in Delhi University, particularly the mobilization of the Sampradayika Virodhi Andolan was one of the signposts in the way in which students and faculty of Delhi University saw themselves in relationship with the society and state at large. So let me invite these speakers in the order that they've been listed here, and I would therefore invite Dr. Ananya Vajpayee first, who is going to speak on divergent paradigms and tangled histories.
Thank you, Anupama. Am I audible? It's absolutely thrilling to be back in JNU and to see such a huge turnout for a conference that's happening in the middle of your vacation. I'd really like to congratulate all of you at JNU Academic, in CPS and in the larger university community who've come together to make this possible and invited scholars from other institutions into your campus. I was asked to reflect on violence through some of the writing that I've done, both on Indian political theory as well as on the question of how does one address Western political theory, continental political philosophy, what is the relationship between these traditions of thought, and how those are refracted through our histories that are both separate as well as meeting in moments of encounter, especially through the colonial experience. So I'm going to do that, and then I'm very quickly going to try to bring us into the present, because especially as Anupama was just saying on the question of violence, it's very important to keep that front and center in our discussions, not just of theory, of concepts, of histories and so on, but of the everyday lived experience that we have as citizens of a very, very precariously poised democracy. For me, the journey into exploring violence as an object of scholarship, as an object of thought, as a question of engagement in the classroom as well as in a wider public sphere, began with the violence against Muslims in Gujarat in 2002. For me, that was personally a turning point where it became impossible to really think about the questions. I was a graduate student at that time. I was working on Maharashtra, I was working on Shivaji and caste politics in the 17th century, and it suddenly became impossible to continue to live in the past in a way that ignored what was happening in the society around me. At that time, I had an opportunity to teach a course at the National Law School in Bangalore, and it was called Caste, Communalism and the Law, and it was a social science course for fifth-year law students. And in reading for that, I began to understand that communalism and communal violence, as well as caste and caste-related inequality and violence, can be also, they can be understood in a presentist sense and in a post-colonial context and framing of the republic, of the democracy, etc. But they also have a longer history, and it's important to look at ways in which history informs the present, which is something that I still continue to try to do. At that time, after Gujarat unfolded and started to completely break apart the social consensus, arguably you could say this had already begun with Babri Masjid, and you could even argue that it had begun earlier on, as Dilip does indeed take us back to 1984 in much of his work. And of course, in the end, you have to go back to partition. But I think for our generation, really 2002 was that threshold when these things, pass out of the abstract and become very real. I started reading about categories that address what I call violent space and violated person. In sort of the hegemonic theoretical discourses that were available at that time. And I started reading about the history of the Holocaust. I started reading about what happened in the totalitarian states of Europe at the end of World War II. And I started reading in particular Agamben, and then reading back through Agamben, Benjamin, Foucault, Arendt, and other modern thinkers of violence. And it seemed to me that categories of camp, refugees, state of exception, their life, from the tradition of Carl Schmitt as well on the other side, and Arendt. These provided a way of thinking about what happens to persons and what happens to societies and communities in a context of such extreme conflict and violence. I subsequently wrote about this, having traveled through instances of what I could see as refugee camps, which came up in Gujarat. They were coming up in Jammu and in Delhi for refugees from Kashmir. I started looking into the histories of the northeast, of Kashmir, of Gujarat, of the Naxal belt within India. And I realized that the state of exception was not something out there long ago, far away in Europe, etc., but it's something that was also somehow being articulated in our own political and historical and social environment. But how were the particularities of the European experience going to be translated? Were they being translated? Did they have relevance? I mean, at some point, one thought, of course there's violence and of course there's conflict, but we don't really have an instance of genocide in this part of the world. And then you take another step and you say, is that true or is that not true? And can you do without a category like genocide if you start to look at the histories of Sri Lanka or of Myanmar or indeed of the conflict between India and Pakistan over Kashmir and so on. So how I ended up writing about this was in the form of a letter written to Agamben. Now, the device of a letter was meant as a conceit, because I wanted to foreground the question of whether two kinds of traditions of political thought can address one another, and if there can be an answer, right? I mean, it's not quite a dialogue, but it is a form of address. And I wanted to say I'm writing from within my own history, within my own location, within my own context, within my own society. I am fully cognizant of your terminology, of your history, of the genealogy of ideas that you have produced and that you work with. And I am trying to see if we can have this conversation. If I can talk to you and if you can answer me back, right? Does a camp mean the same thing? When you're talking about a death camp or when you're talking about a partition refugee camp, does a refugee, the figure of the refugee, is that something that we also think of in Arendtian terms, as the subject of rights or the denial of rights, or are we thinking in some different way about refugees? In a post-colonial context, in a question of the national state and how refugees are treated, within the sort of very key moment of partition, when refugees in fact are becoming citizens of new nations, and so on. So the device of a letter was not, it was not literally a letter to a government, although later on I did go and meet him. And I found that he had never got my letter, even though it was published. But the fact of the matter is that I wanted to say that there are different histories, and perhaps we need different conceptual vocabularies, even if we are talking about universal phenomena like violence. And how do we evolve those from our situated, historically located, and experiential, selves? How are we able to come to that point where what is happening to you makes sense to me, but it doesn't make sense beyond a point, and vice versa? So that's where that project was, and it took me to the Northeast. I wrote about resentment in the context of Manipur. I wrote about bare life in the context of Kashmir. I continued to look at partition and so on. In my book, as you know, it's largely about political thought and histories of political thought, how those are refracted through colonialism, and how modern India emerges as a conversation between colonial categories and pre-modern categories, in the sense of its foundational political architecture, conceptual architecture. But looking at Gandhi and Ambedkar particularly, I won't talk about the others here, it seemed to me that once again the question of violence was quite central. But not violence in the same way that we find in, let's say, Arendt, Foucault, and so on, right? Because I felt that both Gandhi, when he looks at communal violence, and Ambedkar, when he looks at caste violence, are essentially primarily concerned, they are concerned with colonialism and imperialism. They are also concerned with social justice and social inequality, right? In different ways and to different extents, and using different methods of reading society and politics. But there is a primacy of the self in both of their quests, and I have elaborated on this. I'm not going to try to argue about it right now. But I would say that if Swaraj is directed at the violence of the colonial and the imperial project, right? Ahimsa is something that is directed at the perpetrator of violence, the violence within the self, not the violence that one experiences as a victim, let's say, of colonialism or of any other type of injustice, but the violence that arises within one as a way of relating to others and to the world, right? How to deal with that, how to purge the self of that violence, how to purify the self, to use D.R. Nagaraj's terms. So mastering the violence within, the hinsa within us, also becomes one of the directions that the project of Swaraj then takes for Gandhi. For Ambedkar, his concern is with social justice and with Dalit identity. And again, as D.R. Nagaraj has pointed out, a lot of the anger that arises from the violence that one experiences on the self, the humiliation, the discrimination, and so on, that anger is directed towards others. But how is the self to be fortified against this constant assault of violence which caste society produces, especially on the untouchable? Through self-respect, right? Through positing an inalienable dignity for the self and insisting upon it, and then enshrining that in the idea of democratic citizenship, which is something that Ambedkar played such a big role in creating through the Constitution. I mean, these are just very broad lineaments of how one was thinking about violence in one frame and then in another frame. And I also want to make the link between a conversation with theory, which is largely European, and a history of Indian political thought, which is closely allied to Indian political struggles, aspirations, ideals, and values, and which is quite impressively actually enshrined in the Constitution, which is a rare thing in the world in general, I would say. In subsequent years, in the last few years, I've been more and more engaged with the question of minorities, because minorities, I think, in a way bring together very large and abstract questions of citizenship, of the nature of our state, of majoritarianism, which we are dealing with, and of human and individual and political rights that are supposed to be at the basis of our democratic quality, as we seem to be getting further and further away from them. But they also go back. The question of minorities also takes us back to all types of minoritization that this society practices and entrenches, including on the vectors of caste, urban versus non-urban, tribal communities, all forms of marginality and minoritism that exist in our society. That eventually, as Prathama was saying in the morning, render us less active citizens and those who exercise our rights, rather recipients of various kinds of aid and succor from the state, more passive recipients. So effectively tending more towards a refugee and moving away from a paradigm of citizenship, right? Or each of us being minoritized for different reasons by a state that is becoming more and more biopolitical. Now, what do I mean by that? The modern state is biopolitical in its conception. I think those of us who are Foucauldians would agree with that, and Mbembe takes that further to the idea of a necropolitics. Not just manipulating life, but also manipulating death is how the state asserts its power over the people, including citizens of democracies. But the distance between bare life and citizenship appears to be closing in a time when we have newer instruments of state power that are being openly and assertively used. Now, you could argue that in a way the colonial state had already inaugurated certain kinds of processes of classification and biopolitical control through the census, through the army, through ethnographic surveys, through race science, and all of that sort of, plethora of disciplines, of the colonial disciplines, including linguistics, by the way, including management of epidemics and of famines and so on, population management, demographics of various kinds, that the colonial state had already set those processes into motion. But I would say that the Indian state, after the moment of liberalization, beginning in the early 1990s, after Mandal and Mandir and Market have all become part of our mainstream political discourse, has now openly declared its biopolitical intentions through Aadhaar, for example, through the NRC and the CAA, through a new form of identification, classification of the entire population, through new statistical methods to count and manage people with the purpose of including and excluding at the same time, with the purpose of functioning with majorities and minorities. And this is not just electorally, this is also through the entire field of public health, because COVID provided that opportunity. So if you look at technologies or platforms like Ayush and CoWIN, the whole vaccination regime, and you read those in tandem with the coming of Aadhaar, etc., and continue to think about how that links with the already existing architecture of exceptional laws like the AFSPA, like the UAPA, like POTA before that, etc., which are applied to greater and greater and greater sections of our population, then you begin to understand that, the violence that perhaps we thought we had overcome through decolonization and through the coming of a constitutional democracy and through the achievement of Swaraj, that kind of state violence has returned and is asserting itself once more through the operations of the majoritarian state. And it's not only the majoritarian state that has created these techniques or is using them. They were already set in motion over the last 30-40 years, I would say probably since the emergency. And we've reached a point where our rights are really very, very, very attenuated and endangered today. And you can see this writ large in something like Article 370 in Kashmir, and you no longer need to go to some corner of the country somewhere to feel that citizens' rights are under assault from a pervasive regime that is premised on that's a Hobbesian regime that is premised on the monopoly of violence in a very, very brutal sense. And I would say that this is a time for us to possibly return to thinkers like Gandhi and Ambedkar, because they helped to create a bridge between our human self and our political self, as well as the state and society and the political society in which we find ourselves embedded and in which we struggle for greater justice, for greater equality, and for greater social cohesion. So I'm going to stop there, and I'd welcome your questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Vajpayee. I'll now invite Professor Aparna Vaidik, who is going to speak on writing histories of violence.
So, coming here to this conference is a lesson in, it's a lesson for me because I'm reminded I should read my emails properly. So, I said yes the moment I saw JNU Academic, and I came here and I realized the conference was in political theory. हाँ, तो कल से मैं आतंकित और भयभीत हूँ, हाँ, और हाँ, बहुत ज़बरदस्त, हाँ, तो so I am like a historian, right? So I'm going to give you something in the next 20 minutes. I hope somewhere it connects to all the lovely theoretical paradigms that you work with and the authors that you read. So please treat my offering as a, as an offering only. And okay, so थोड़ा poetry भी है मेरे इसमें, हाँ, एक दो poem बोलूँगी बीच में हिंदी में. If you don't get Hindi enough, tell me, I'll translate. So this ये कोई Hindu nationalism type नहीं है. So just, yeah, you guys are a tough audience. I was a student here, and then I could just say, abhi tables have been turned. I was the one sitting there and heckling, right? Now it's I run the risk of that. So, so a little bit about how I came to be working in histories of violence. So, like Ananya, my journey was starting a year earlier with 9/11 actually. Yeah, and soon after, few years after that, I moved to US to teach there, and. So I encountered a society which is highly fear-ridden, which is in throes of, all sorts of state strategies to deal with global terrorism and all that. And somewhere my own thinking and need to connect back to India shifted what I was doing. So I'm actually trained as a spatial historian in Indian Ocean. I do a history of Andaman and all that. Yeah, wo sab chhut gaya, that got left behind, and I started working on history of revolutionaries. And at that time, I was working on trying to do this global terrorism thing. And at some point, I dropped that also. And I ended up working on the history of HRA and HSRA. So my last work is on that, and there's a forthcoming thing again. So it's and after that, I don't think I'll go back to the revolutionaries ever again. I'll be done with that. But today, what I'm going to speak about is another turn that my work took in 2014, was it? When the Dadri lynching happened. Yeah, and 13 or something, yeah? 14, or, so it is in the living memory of all of us. Now, something really shifted for me there, as Ananya was saying, for her, for Gujarat riots. Now, what shifted for me was that my family I come from a Hindu Mahasabha family. You'll rarely find academics who come from this kind of a background. Yeah, because all of us are supposed to be liberal, secular, and all of that. Yeah, or we have to be coming from these minority backgrounds, so it's okay to be a certain. So I didn't fit the frame. Yeah, to the point it's not just that they're Hindu Mahasabha, they are deriding of RSS, that RSS are lesser intellectuals. Right? And my uncle, my chacha, owns only one kacha, which is brown. So that kind of family, right? So. And you can imagine where I'm on a family WhatsApp group trying to say something, and then what happens. So, there is this famous, I think Martha Nussbaum, or some historian of emotions, I think that's Martha Nussbaum. She says, men sometimes do with their mouths what they can't do with their penises. So I had that happen to me on some of the family WhatsApp groups. And nights of feeling very painful about the whole thing and all that. And out of that, my work took a little bit of a turn, and from that came out a book. Yeah, so today I'll offer you something from there, from that space. Yeah, that space which was ambivalent, the space which was pained and scared. Yeah, which found the craft, the historian crafts, not capacious enough to carry what I wanted to say. So I had to step out of that frame, yeah, and to say it differently. इसलिए like that's why I titled the talk as Writing Histories of Violence. कि उसको लिखते कैसे, हिंसा के बारे में लिखा कैसे जाता? How do I not indulge in voyeurism? How do I not indulge in breastfeeding? How do I access the mind of an ordinary person who, on daily basis, like I'll take the example of my grandfather, Hindu Mahasabha man. टोटली घर में दो ही पिक्चर है, एक सावरकर का लगा हुआ है, दूसरा किसका तो है, हाँ. So like that's the way it is. But he is the first one to even go. जैसे हमारे he was an iron trader, लोहा मंडी में उनकी दुकान थी. So the shop next door shop is this Harun Kaka, and Harun Kaka's shop got burnt in one riot. So the person who's going to stand behind him, get his shop repaired, get all his stuff done, is my grandfather. Yeah. Then he'll go ahead and write a pamphlet which is anti-Muslim. Yeah. और उसका प्रचार भी करेंगे. So how do I make sense of this world? How do I make sense of this man? How do I make sense of what's going on inside me? Because I love him also. Yeah. And what he does makes me not want to love him. Yeah. So a part of my becoming a historian was because of him. So how do I engage with that? तो उसके लिए थोड़ा I stepped out of academia, थोड़ा सोचा लिखा, तो वो शेयर करती हूँ थोड़ा आपके साथ. So today is the thing I am taking a leaf from. I know यहाँ पे बहुत there's been a discussion about theory, so I'm a little nervous. So please forgive me for that. So I'm taking a leaf out of Ganesh Devi's Bhasha tradition, yeah, and to talk about one myth, yeah. And this myth is then again connected to the family story that I was going to tell about my grandfather. So now why the myths? Because they're part of the living traditions. And sometimes these myths are not part of the formalized knowledge systems. So I know I run the risk as a historian of looking at a myth and not giving you historical data as such, but just indulge me for 20 minutes, yeah. So I'll foreground the idea of what is a myth, and then I will talk about the myth. So a myth is essentially is a story that a lot of people believe in, although they know it is not true. Yeah, so the truth claim of the myth, like the idea whether it is true or not is irrelevant. Huh? People believe in it, irrespective. So myths do not carry the burden of proof. And unlike historians or history writing, where we have to have evidence, so myths often serve as their own evidence. And here in myths, facts appear as self-explanatory, and myths present stories as the natural order of things. The characters in the story appear natural, and the best action is the one that aligns with the order. And myths also come to us sometimes as innocent speech. उनको believe करने का मन करता है because your grandmother told you, or somebody told you that story, so you want to believe in it. So it comes to you as innocent speech. Yeah, and sometimes in that innocent speech, apparently, politics, ideology and signification are absent. But that's not true, but I'm just saying that that's the way it arrives to us. That उन किस्से कहानियों में विश्वास करने का मन करता है. Yeah? Now, why do we have myths? What role do they play in a society's life? So just very simple, and all this is stolen from Roland Barthes and all of you must have read and your teachers must be teaching you. Huh? So myths anchor the present in a past. वो anchoring का काम करती है. थोड़ा सा कहीं हाँ हमारे यहाँ ये हुआ करता था. So there is a story. Yeah, in that story we find ourselves. So it's a way of anchoring our present. It's a way of locating ourselves in the present through this past. And this past doesn't have a specified time. It can be any time. Yeah? And that's what makes these myths so magical, you know? The myths also serve as a great legitimation device. they play, and they can play, they don't always, but they can play a didactic role in establishing the order of things. Yeah, create communities, tell us what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. And third, myths also generate a common sense. Now you would have come across this word while looking at Gramsci and Bourdieu. So I'm just giving you the connections with theory so that you have something to take back. So the myths generate a common sense also, a sensibility about something, and that's what I'll talk about. Yeah. So now I'll take you through one myth, yeah, one story, yeah, and then we'll go back to this of is it doing the job that I was saying let's do. So this is the story of this guy called Barbarik. Now some of you may know him if you come from Rajasthan. If you don't know him, it's okay, I'm just going to tell you. So Barbarik appears in Skanda Puran, and he appears in folklores of Telugu, Hindi and Rajasthani languages. But in variations, Barbarik appears across Kerala, Andhra, Odisha, Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh and Nepal. So this is again a thing that is pan in the subcontinent. You'll find it again and again this way. So who is this child? Now Barbarik is the son of Ghatotkach. I know I'm taking example from Mahabharata, just be with me, indulge me for a few minutes. And he's said to be the son of Bhim and Hidimba. Yeah? And Ghatotkach married this woman called Kam Kantaka, and she was a daughter of Ferocious, a demon, and Unka Beta, their son was Barbarik. Now that's one story. In another story, Barbarik is the son of Bhim, not the grandson, and he's come out of this woman Bhim engages with. Her name is Ahilavati, who is a Nagakarya. So that's him in different stories. Now he's named Barbarik in many of these stories because of his hair. Yeah, because his hair, the description is, uske baal ghungrale the, ya nag ke saman the. So it's like Medusa-like hair. Yeah? So that's why Barbar, he's called Barbarik. Now the name also refers to his status as a Rakshas, as a non-Aryan. Yeah, and that's the key to the story. So in the story, there are various variants. I'll give you 2-3 variants quickly. So in the story, basically, this poor guy gets his head chopped off by Krishna. So in one story, during the battle of Mahabharata, people are bragging. They're sitting in the court and bragging of who's the better warrior. So Arjuna gets up and says, makes the claim that if I were to end the war, I can end it in a day. And Barbarik then says, I can end it in a few minutes. So obviously it's not liked, and Krishna is very upset, takes out his Sudarshan Chakra, and you know what happens? He just lops in one go. Very efficient weapon. So his head is chopped off, rolled off. That's one story. In another story, he's in a forest. Yeah, and he's asked to prove his mettle as a warrior, and Krishna asks him to pierce all the leaves in the forest. And he hides one leaf under his foot. Yeah. So Barbarik not only pierces all the leaves with his arrow, but also he pierces the one under Krishna's foot. So he's proved to be a great warrior, but he is invincible only when fighting on the losing side. So Krishna is a clever statesman. He says, "Ye to jeetne nahi dega, ye to war khatam hi nahi hone dega. So let me do one thing." Krishna pulls out a mirror and gives it to Barbarik to say, "You need to kill the warrior who's inside the mirror, inside this." And Barbarik doesn't know, he looks at it, sees his face, he's been conned, but he's a generous guy. So he says, "Le lo mera sar." So his head is cut off. Yeah. So this is how he ends up losing his head. But the story goes further, where he is turned into divine. There's an apotheosis of Barbarik. Yeah. Now, in one story, Devi Chandika comes, when he's cut off his head, she pours nectar into Barbarik's head, and then the revived head says, "I want to watch the Mahabharata." Yeah. So Krishna is very generous, puts him on a stick, puts him on a hillock, and from there he watches Mahabharata. Okay. In another story, he's just sitting on the stick watching the Mahabharata, and the battle ends, and people ask him, "Jeet kiske karan hui? Who did we win with? Who do we owe our win to?" So he says all he saw was Sudarshan Chakra and Draupadi drinking blood. So Krishna is very happy. He says, "Chal, you are blessed." Yeah. So and then he is given the apotheosis. We think that it is the head that was sacrificed, but it was not the head; it was the body that was the sacrifice. That was sacrificed because the body was the most potent part of his body, of his being, not his body. So, what's the implication of the myth? Yeah? So, the implication is, as I draw it out, there could be several, it established the natural order of things. And the natural order of things was that Arjun was the warrior prince, the Aryan warrior prince, and he had to be the mightiest. That order was restored because Barbaric was beheaded. Second implication is, Barbaric is beheaded but not killed. So, why? So, not killing him obviated Krishna's guilt and redeemed Krishna's actions from criminality. So, Krishna could not, because Krishna is the one who's enabling redemption. So, he's become the nimit through which he is acquiring divinity. And Barbaric and his people were an important resource. Had he been exterminated, who would cultivate the land? Who would guard the forest? Who would fight the battles? Who would cremate and bury the dead? And who would remove the carcasses of dead cows from the villages? Koi to karega na kam. And the third is, Barbaric's story is also a story of miscegenation. Yeah? It's racial intermixing through sexual union. And that is not something we like. Yeah? A person born in the non-Aryan union was a violation of order of things. So who pays for it? Barbaric pays for it. And cutting off his body also meant that he won't have any children of his own. And what did this mean? Ensuring Arjuna's and Krishna's lineage continues. And it's Parikshit in the end who becomes the ruler. Yeah? So, how is the story told? How do we receive the story? So it comes as part of the large Mahabharata story. As a story of redemption. But whose redemption? So who are the victims in the story? Who are the wrongdoers or whatever? So the victims in the story are actually the Pandavas whose patrimony is taken away from them. Yeah? Krishna, whose uncle tried to kill him. Draupadi, who was violated by her own. And they are the ones receiving redemption because Arjun rises to be this great warrior because of hard work. Krishna becomes the Dharmaraj, and Draupadi manages to annihilate the Pandava, the dynasty, restoring her honor. So it's a story of their redemption. But who is paying the blood price in this story? One, Barbaric, I told you. Two others, you guys yourself know. Does anyone want to say? Thank you, Eklavya and Karn. Thank you. You guys know the story. So, what do they get in the return? Yeah, what they get lauded as Danveer, generous, brave givers. Yeah, Danveer Karn. They get a chance. This was their chance to redeem the stain of low birth, and the price was to make Arjuna the mightiest warrior. So you serve the Lord and you remove the stain. And they also get to save their community. Yeah, Barbaric's individual sacrifice saved the forest people from the wrath of the Aryans. So it deflected the violence away from the community. So what's our takeaway from the story? It's simple, all of you know it, I'll just summarize it for you. This apotheosis invisibilizes Barbaric's identity because he is worshipped as Krishna. He reached divinity but as Krishna. His labor gets written out of history. His body is annihilated. All this is violence which is invisibilized in this myth. Yeah? And this is the invisible violence that I am talking about today. एक छोटा कविता हो जाए पॉइंट है कि violence बहुत ज़्यादा है.
You have 4 minutes.
4 minutes में. So I have one poem by Agay, yeah, and the poem is called जो पुल बनाएंगे, the ones who built the bridges. सेनाएं हो जाएंगी पार, मारे जाएंगे रावण, जयी होंगे राम, जो निर्माता रहे इतिहास में बंदर कहलाए. The makers of the bridge were written into history as monkeys. And Jai kiski hui? Ram ki. So this parable or this myth tells us the story of how we understand violence. Violence done to uphold dharma is not even violence. Dharma purifies violence. तो भागवत साहब सही कहते हैं, lynching is not an Indian word, because we have a better word for it called dharma yudh. Yeah? It invisibilizes violence completely, this story, yeah? And especially the violence committed in the name of dharma. And what does this then in turn, this invisibilization do for us? It generates an even larger myth. Yeah? And what is that myth? It creates an imagination of Hinduism as tolerant and this capacious religion, which many of us pay homage to on days we distinguish it from Hindutva. And it creates a common sense view of India as being tolerant and a non-violent society. Now this view you will find in variations of this view in Amartya Sen's work, in Shashi Tharoor's work, in pop writers like Devdutt Patnaik and Hindol Singh. All peddle different versions, sorry, I didn't mean it. You looked at me when you said so, अच्छा संजीव सान्याल भी अभी उनका एक रेवोल्यूशंस पे किताब है. So and then there is this liberal invocation of ahimsa. हाँ, अशोका, उसका धम्मा, Sufi Bhakti tradition, Ganga Jamni, सब invocation happens. हाँ? But so that's another mythology that's it created. And then these stories of violence actually create a division. Yeah, they divide our world between the good perpetrator, yeah, who inflicts violence in the name of dharma, the bad perpetrator, which is in all theorization the state, the lumpen, the gangster, the corporate, the business. Huh? But it also creates an innocent bystander. Yeah? Ordinary people who go about their daily routines and people who do the politics of not in my name. They are innocent bystanders. This innocent bystander can be understood through Hannah Arendt's banality of evil. The Jewish writer, I think all of you know, so she says it is not carried out by big generals or officers, but normal, ordinary, everyday people. And it's easier to understand the mind of Aristotle, Spinoza, Dante, Carl Schmitt, Heidegger, Savarkar, Nehru and Gandhi, but infinitely harder to grasp the mind of an ordinary person, the obscure people, like my grandfather. And so, what am I trying to do over here? What I'm offering to you is my understanding of why tolerance fails. Why tolerance is an insufficient framework to understand violence or to understand Indian democracy or Indian heritage and all of that. Tolerance, and here I am drawing on Priya Kumar's work. There's a great article she's written on comparing Savarkar's Hindutva with Nehru's discovery of India. And she actually shows us the similarities between the two texts. She's saying, oh yeah, I'll just finish it. So tolerance, in other words, is mainly granted by those in power. Sabal deta hai. And it is given to people who deviate from it. It is never reciprocal. वो कभी भी पारस्परिक या आपसदारी की नहीं होती है. वापस नहीं लेते हैं, हम देते हैं. And the hegemonic work or the hegemonic group and the majoritarian group is typically constructed as universal and secular. And theory is also constructed as universal and secular. Whereas minority groups are viewed as saturated by their religious and cultural identities. धर्मलिप्त, उसके आगे बढ़ ही नहीं सकते. And / as experience. So there is a pause for us to think about how we are thinking about theory and experience. And just I'll end with this thing of what implication it has. And here I am seeking to speak for somebody else, and forgive me, I'm doing that, yeah, because I think you were corrected about it in the morning in a certain way, so I'm being a little wary. So where does this leave the Muslims in India, or people practicing a certain kind of politics? So, and this is something, it comes up in my conversations with some of my Muslim colleagues, and they say, and this is a sentence I got from there, कि आपकी tolerance का burden मैं उठाता हूँ. Yeah? So the Muslim as a category, quote unquote, bears the burden of Hindus' tolerance. It makes them into passive historical actors, as non-doers in the meta-story. And at times, what are they reduced to? What is that offer for them? What is it for them to do if they're to do something? And that is the ritual performance of patriotism. Yeah? देश प्रेम का एक औपचारिक प्रदर्शन, झंडा लगा लो, यहाँ पेंट कर लो, कुछ कर लो, और becoming Marxist, becoming these cultural Muslims. Yeah. Okay. So I'll conclude now.
Thank you. Thank you, Aparna.
अरे मेरा conclusion रह गया, एक second. ताली बजा. So पहले मेरा खत्म करा दिया इसे. So Indian democracy has always been open to majoritarian mobilization. तो यार जो बहुत यूनिक हम लोग लगता है, हमें लगता है कि इट्स हैपनिंग समथिंग, इट्स ऑलवेज बिन ओपन टू दैट. दिस कैन नॉट बी क्योर्ड अंटिल द टाइम, अब मेरा प्रिस्क्रिप्शन एज दवा देते हैं, पानी से पीवे लाभ पावे. It cannot be cured until the time India is not only home for Muslims, but a home where they can also play hosts. जहाँ वो गेस्ट या माइनॉरिटी या छोटे भाई के रूप में नहीं, जहाँ उनको दूसरों को आतिथ्य देने का मौका हो. Okay, so I'm going to stop here.
Thank you. Let me now invite Professor Dilip Simeon. He is going to speak on the end of law.
Having spoken in Ramdas College for 20 long years, you have grown old senior, just put on a big. I can increase the volume without any technical assistance. But anyway, I hope I'm audible now. Not audible.
Can this be made there?
Hello. Okay. Can you hear me now? Yes. All right. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be back in JNU after many years. The last time any students invited me was 2013. Not okay. I'll talk louder. Don't worry. I'll talk louder. The last time students invited me was 2013. And after that, I wasn't invited. Maybe what I said wasn't very pleasing. But I've been coming to JNU since the 1970s and spoken here many times from the 1980s onwards. So it's a great pleasure to be amongst you again. Since my name is Simeon, I think I can use the occasion to talk something about monkeys, since we just referred to them. So this is just by the by, it's got nothing to do with violence. I was once shown a cartoon by India's greatest cartoonist, Lakshman, in which there were two fellows standing outside an academic doctor's room, and in the room there was a table, and in the table there was a monkey, and the monkey had a hat and was busy writing something, and the one fellow tells the other fellow, yes, he came here for an experiment and now he's become head of department. So, with my apologies to any heads of department. It's a commentary on the state of Indian education. But, and I've been very much part of it. So, I've chosen this name of this seminar as the end of law, just as a pointer to you to take a look at a book called The End of Law, written by someone called William Scheuermann. It's about Carl Schmitt, and it's very, very interesting. I just took the opportunity to mention it to you. The other day I was having a chat with a very old comrade going back 50 years. And as usual, the conversation with comrades is कि Indian Revolution failed क्यों हो गया? So he told me that I just listened because some people just go on the straight line, straight and narrow path. And he said, एक कारण इसका ये है कि leadership का class character petty बुझा था. So I said, साले तेरा class character क्या था? लेनिन का class character क्या था? He said, हम तो exceptions हैं. So you see, Carl Schmitt had it right, state of exception. Sovereign is he who decides on the exception. It's very easy to find sovereigns littered all over the place. They all decide the exception. So it's a philosophical problem, so we should keep it in mind. But anyway, I just want to place some issues before you because I feel that we need to get down to earth. One is that we have a culture, a polity in South Asia where political assassination has become a norm. Political science and political sociologists study it. Just take a look around you. Because communal riots and communal pogroms are also political assassinations. You're assassinating people, they may be common people. But Liaquat Ali was assassinated. Mujibur Rahman's whole family was assassinated. Zulfikar Bhutto was assassinated. Benazir Bhutto was assassinated. Indira Gandhi was assassinated. Sant Longowala was assassinated. Bandarag Naike was assassinated. Rajiv Gandhi was assassinated. It just goes on and on. So why is there so much assassination? So this is something worthy of discussion. Why is there so much genocide? Why has it become normalized? So as I said, communal riots or communal pogroms are assassinations. I've been thinking about these issues, not academically, although it should be dealt with academically and historically and so on, but I've been forced to think about it, because of my own past as a comrade in a movement that was dedicated to political assassination, in which you were told that cruelty is something to be sort of glorified. If you read some of those texts written by Charu Mazumdar, I don't want to quote them here because you never know, I might be placed under detention. You know, because one is quoting someone and one is told that you actually believe it. I don't believe it. But I can tell you that Charu Mazumdar's approach to politics was a glorification of assassination. There was not a single question that you asked him in which the response was not always the standard one that we have not killed enough people. Class enemies, of course, policemen, of course, etc., etc. So what gives someone the right to put an end to someone else's life without any due process of law? So the end of law is not simply confined to the end of law brought about by rightists, but the end of law has been brought about by many other people. So violence is the ground shared by enemies. And the ideological celebration and glorification of martyrdom and violence is the ground shared by propaganda of across the spectrum. I would urge you to rise beyond this factional delimitation of violence. It's the ground shared by enemies. And we have to think about it seriously if we are engaged in serious conversation. Okay? So that's one issue. Now, there's, as I said, in my experience, in my own personal experience, I remember when I was teaching in Ramjas College, I became the victim of violence. And I remember students coming to me and saying, you know, we'll take revenge. I was in the hospital.